The sensor alarm did not gradually build. To a crescendo it screamed, 1 second. There was silence across the entire heliopause grid, and the next every board on relay outpost HFY lit up in colors I had never seen on a real display in 11 years of service. Red eye, new orange, I knew, the deep violet that flooded my screens at 3:12 hours on a Tuesday morning was something I had only seen in training simulations, and even then only in the scenario labeled Extinction Class Event. I was halfway through my third cup of terrible coffee. The mug hit the floor and I did not look down. HFY confirm reading, I said. Not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because the protocol demanded it, and my mouth needed something to do, while my brain caught up with what my eyes were telling me. The station's voice, calm, neutral, completely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed, came back immediately. Confirmed, Commander Voss, fold space. Emergency event, multiple signatures. Outer heliopause boundary. The count kept updating, it did not stop. For a long time, my name is Mara Voss, and was at that moment a commander. The United Earth Defense Force, assigned to deep space early warning operations. My station was small, 12 personnel. Sensor array the size of a city block, and enough processing power to track a sparrow across the solar system. We were the first line of awareness, not the first line of defense. Our job was to see things coming and tell someone who could do something about it. I stared at the count on my screen, 17,214. Individual contacts. They had arrived in a pattern, a perfect sphere centered exactly on our sun, with every ship equidistant from its neighbors. It was not a battle formation, it was a statement. They had drawn a cage around our entire solar system, and they wanted us to know it. I had read about the Cath Empire the way most people read about ancient history, with detached curiosity and the comfortable certainty that it was someone else's problem. The Cath had been out there for longer than human civilization had existed. They had consumed 41 other species. The ones they considered useful became workers. The ones they considered threatening became warnings. The ones they simply did not like became nothing at all. We had known they were coming for nearly 6 decades. Not a guess, not a fear, a certainty. Built from intercepted signals, recovered probe fragments, and a single transmission we had found drifting past the orbit of Neptune 22 years ago. It was addressed to no one in particular, which is how we knew it was addressed to us. It said in Cath formal register that the solar system had been cataloged for resource evaluation and population assessment. What it meant, stripped of the formal language, was we are coming to decide what to do with you. Earth's governments had argued about the right response for 4 years. Some wanted to broadcast peaceful overtures. Some wanted to begin evacuation plans. Some wanted to pretend we had not received the message and hope the problem resolved itself. A very small number of people, engineers, strategists, veterans of smaller conflicts, people who had spent careers thinking about worst-case scenarios, said something different. They said we should spend the next several decades making sure the answer to whatever the Cath were coming to decide was already waiting for them when they arrived. Those people were given funding and told to be quiet about it. Commander, it was Lieutenant Owen Fry, my youngest officer, 26 years old and currently the color of old paper. He was standing at The communications array with his. Headset half on, we have a transmission. Incoming from the Cath formation, wide. Beam, it is broadcasting to the entire inner system, put it through, the voice. That filled the station was not what I expected. I had anticipated something. Harsh, mechanical, a sound built for intimidation. Instead, the translated feed gave us something almost conversational, deep, measured, the tone of someone who had delivered this same speech many times before and had never once needed to raise their voice. People of the solar system, you have been assessed. Your civilization presents a medium-level resource yield and a low-level military threat. You are hereby given a period of 48 standard hours to submit formal surrender documentation to the Imperial reception fleet. Full compliance will result in a reclassification to Tier 4 labor status. Partial compliance will result in selective reduction. Non-compliance will result in system sterilization. This transmission is your only notification. The Empire does not negotiate with Tier 3 species. This offer is a courtesy. It ended. Owen was looking at me. Everyone in the station was looking at me. I realized I was still holding my coffee mug even though I had watched it fall to the floor earlier. I must have picked it up without noticing. Tier 3, said Senior Analyst Claire Hooper from her station across the room. Her voice was not frightened, it was offended. They classified us as Tier 3. Do you know what Tier 3 means? In their system, it means they think we're still using chemical fuel rockets. How old is their survey data? I asked. Based on what they just said about our military capacity, at least 40 years. 40 years, the Cath Empire had pointed 17,000 warships at us using information that was 40 years out of date. They did not know what we had built. They did not know what we had hidden. They did not know that the question of what to do about them had been answered quietly, incrementally, without press releases or public announcements by 80 years of people who understood that they will probably never come is not the same as they will definitely never come. I set the mug down carefully on the edge of my console and reached for the command relay. This is Commander Marava's relay outpost Hestia, transmitting on UDEF Priority Alpha. We have confirmed emergence of a Cath totality ring formation at the heliopause boundary. Ship count is 17,214. A surrender demand has been broadcast. 48-hour window. Terms classified as Standard Imperial Subjugation Protocol. I paused, looked at the violet bloom still covering my screens. UDF command. I am formally activating the protocol. Iron Veil notification chain. I say. Again, Iron Veil notification. Please confirm receipt. The response came in under 4 seconds. Hestia, this is UDF. Command receipt confirmed. Protocol. Iron Veil is now active. Stand by for system-wide coordinate broadcast. All outpost personnel are instructed to maintain station and hold current positions. Owen let out a long, slow breath. They confirmed it in 4 seconds. They have been waiting for that call for 30 years, I said, outside the stations. Observation port space looked the same as it always did, deep, dark, and endless. But I knew that in the time it had taken me to drink a cup of coffee and drop it on the floor, the most powerful military force in the known galaxy had drawn a circle around everything I had ever called home, and I knew something they did not know. I knew exactly what was already waiting inside. That circle, I pulled up the cath formation data and began running comparisons against the infrastructure. Maps I had been cleared to see 2 years ago when my posting was upgraded to Priority Alpha Awareness. Every asteroid in the belt, every gas giant, every quiet, unremarkable stretch of open space between Jupiter and the edge of the system, the cath had sailed there. Ships into a carefully prepared answer to a question they had never thought to ask. I watched the formation holding its perfect sphere, and I thought about the engineer who had designed the fold space denial array, a woman named Dr. Harriet Cole, who had died 8 years ago at the age of 91, who had reportedly spent the last decade of her life convinced that nobody would ever actually use her work. I wished I could tell her she was wrong. Owen was still watching me. Commander, what do we do now? We watch, I said, and we stay out of the way of what comes next. I did not need to explain what that meant. The numbers on the screen told the story better than I could. 17,000 ships had arrived expecting 40-year-old data to be accurate. It was not accurate. It had not been accurate for a very long time. And in approximately 44 minutes, assuming the activation sequence ran on schedule, the entire cath fleet was going to discover exactly how inaccurate it was. I poured myself another cup of coffee. My hands were steady. The alarm was still screaming. I turned its volume down to something manageable. There was nothing left for me to do except and watch the most consequential 44 minutes in the history of the human species unfold on a screen that was still the wrong shade of violet. I was fine with that. Some moments are not meant to be participated in. Some moments are meant to be witnessed. The Empire had come to decide our fate. We had already decided it for them. I watched the activation sequence begin at 3:36 hours, and I want to tell you that it was dramatic. A sudden roar of energy, lights blazing across space. Some visible sign that history was turning on its axis, but that is not what happened. What happened looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. One by one across the entire breadth of the solar system, things that had been quiet for decades simply stopped being quiet. I had a full tactical display. Now, UDF command had pushed me alive. Feed the moment Iron Veil went active. Because Relay Outpost Hestia sat at the best observational angle for the heliopause boundary, and they needed eyes that could see both the cath formation and our own systems coming online simultaneously. I was, in a very real sense, the only person in the solar system who could watch both sides of what was about to happen at the same time. The first thing that activated was the fold denial network, Dr. Harriet Cole's masterwork, and I had read enough of her published work to understand it was absolutely a master work. Was built on a principle that they cath had never encountered, because no species had ever had enough time to build it against them. The fold denial array did not destroy fold drives. It did not interfere with engines or weapons. It simply made the mathematics of fold space exit and entry temporarily impossible within a defined volume. In plain terms, once the array was effective, the cath ships could not jump out. They could not call reinforcements in. Whatever was inside the sphere they had drawn around our system was now sealed in with us. It took the cath fleet approximately 6 minutes to realize what had happened. I watched their Formation began to shift, small movements at first, ships turning, presumably attempting test jumps, presumably finding that nothing happened. Then the movements became less organized. Ships were breaking station, slightly trying different positions, as though a different point in space might give different results. It would not. The array covered the entire sphere uniformly. Hestia, this is tactical. Relay Bravo 7, a new voice said over my command channel. It was calm, precise, and belonged to someone I knew by reputation, but had never spoken to directly. Colonel Adrian Marsh, Unit of Strategic Operations, who was coordinating the second phase of Iron Veil from a command center buried 2 km under the lunar surface. We are showing full fold denial coverage. Cath fleet is contained, proceeding to Phase 2. Phase 2 was the part that I had only ever seen in summary documents. Asteroid belt from my screen looked like it was waking up. 4,000 platforms. That was the number I had read in the documents. 4,000 automated defense installations hidden inside hollowed asteroids placed at carefully calculated points throughout the belt. Over the course of 30 years, maintained by skeleton crews who rotated in and out on classified schedules and who had signed agreements so thorough that their own families did not know what they were actually doing out there. Each platform carried a mass driver battery capable of accelerating projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed, and a targeting system that had been running continuous updates on the Cath formation since the moment the first fold emergence was detected. They did not all fire at once. That would have been inefficient. They fired in a rolling sequence calculated to ensure that at any given moment projectiles were in flight to every quadrant of the Cath formation, and that the intervals between impacts were short enough to prevent any organized defensive response. It was not a volley, it was a rhythm, a constant, unrelenting rhythm that had been choreographed by systems far faster and more patient than any human mind. I watched the first impacts register on the Cath fleet positions. 17 ships gone in the first 8 seconds, not damaged. Gone. Mass driver rounds at that velocity do not leave much behind. Then the outer planets began to contribute. I had known intellectually that the Iron Veil preparations extended beyond the asteroid belt. The documents I had access to mentioned outer system supplementary installations and autonomous hunter-killer platforms with numbers that I had privately assumed were optimistic. I was wrong. The numbers were, if anything, conservative. Jupiter's orbital space alone contained enough automated platforms to constitute a significant military force by any pre-Iron Veil standard. Saturn's ring system had been quietly seeded with gravity lens rail cannon arrays over a period of 20 years, devices that bent their own firing paths around the curve of space, meaning they could effectively fire around obstacles and hit targets that should have been geometrically impossible to reach. From Neptune's orbit came the swarms, and the swarms were the thing that I think I will remember longest. Billions of autonomous hunter-killer drones, each one small enough to hold in 2 hands, each one capable of independent target acquisition and tracking, released from storage containers that had drifted in Neptune's gravitational shadow for nearly a decade. They moved in coordinated formations that looked on my screen like weather patterns, vast dark clouds rolling through space in shapes that shifted and reorganized constantly. In response to real-time data, the Cath had never seen anything like them, because nothing like them had ever been built before. The drones had been designed by a team of engineers who had spent 4 years studying every form of coordinated movement in nature, bird flocks, fish schools, insect colonies, and had written the resulting behavioral algorithms into silicon and steel. The Cath formation was, by any reasonable tactical analysis, still enormous. 17,000 ships, most of them still intact. At this point, still trying to maneuver, still attempting to find a response to a situation that was not in any of their doctrines. And then at 4:12 hours UDEF, command transmitted to the Cath fleet. I had not known this part was coming. It was not in any document I had seen. Colonel Marsh had apparently decided, independently or on instruction from higher authority, that the Empire deserved to know exactly what was happening to them and why. The transmission was short. It was delivered in perfect Cath formal register, which told me that someone on Earth had been studying their language for a very long time. Imperial Fleet Commanders, this is the United Earth Defense Force. Your fold drive access has been denied. You are within our prepared defensive perimeter. The installations you are currently engaging have been operational for between 12 and 30 years. You were surveyed 40 years ago. We have not been idle. You are instructed to stand down all offensive systems and hold your current positions. We are prepared to discuss terms of engagement. We are also prepared to continue the current exchange indefinitely. The choice is yours. I listened to the silence that followed and thought about all the things that silence contained. Lieutenant Owen Fry had been quiet for the better part of an hour, watching his screens with the focused intensity of someone who understood that he was watching history and wanted to get the details right. He spoke now quietly, without looking away from his display. Commander, I am picking up internal Cath communications. They are not encrypted, or they are encrypted but not against us. I think they did not expect us to have their cipher keys. I leaned over. What are they saying? He read for a moment, translating in his head. His expression shifted through several things I did not have names for. The Fleet Admiral, his flag designation, translates to something like first voice. He is asking his tactical command for assessment of the threat level. Owen paused. His tactical command has just told him that the threat level is, and I am translating this as accurately as I can beyond their classification. System's upper limit. I straightened up. Is there a response from the Admiral? Yes. Owen looked at me. He said that is not possible. Run the assessment again. I understood that, not because I had any sympathy for what the Cath were doing, but because I understood the specific cognitive difficulty of being confronted by something your entire worldview told you could not exist. The Cath Admiral had spent his career, probably several centuries of it, operating from a framework in which no single planet species could mount a credible defense against an imperial totality ring. It was not arrogance exactly. It was simply that he had never had reason to update that belief, because it had never been wrong before. It was wrong now. Hestia. This is Colonel Marsh. The command channel opened again. We are entering Phase 3. Commander Voss, I need your Outpost to continue monitoring the heliopause boundary for any secondary emergence. The Empire may have reserve fleets positioned outside sensor range. Understood, Colonel. We are watching. There is one more thing. A brief pause. We are dispatching fast response corvettes to the inner engagement zone. You are on the rotation list. Suit up. Commander, this is not over. I looked at the display one more time. The CAF formation was even now still trying to reorganize. They were returning fire. Their weapons were functional. Their crews were capable, and they were not surrendering. Not yet. They were the Cath Empire. They had conquered 41 species. The idea of retreat, of defeat, of anything other than eventual dominance was not something their doctrine contained space for, but something was shifting in the pattern of their movement. I had been watching military formations long enough to recognize the difference between a fleet that is fighting confidently and a fleet that is fighting because it does not know what else to do. The Cath were still fighting, but they were no longer confident. Owen handed me my deployment pack without being asked. He had already sealed his own station for secondary operation mode, which meant the automated systems would handle monitoring while the crew was reduced. He was 26 years old, and he was watching everything with clear eyes. Ready? I asked honestly. No, he said, but let us go anyway. That, I thought, was perhaps the most human thing I had ever heard anyone say. We went. The corvette was called the Ridgeline, and she was not a beautiful ship. She was fast, angular, and built entirely around the philosophy that in a close engagement, the only thing that mattered was that you could move faster than whoever was trying to hit you. She had a crew of 9, and those 9 people had been flying together for 3 years on exercises that I now understood had been considerably more realistic than standard UDEF training rotations. Lieutenant Commander Dale Ockafer, the Ridgeline's captain, did not waste time on introductions when Owen and I came aboard. He simply pointed at 2 empty seats in the tactical bay, told us to strap in, and gave the launch order before I had finished buckling the harness. Current situation, Ockafer said, pulling up the tactical display as the Ridgeline cleared the station docking arm, and the full spread of the engagement appeared on our screens. The Cath formation has been under sustained engagement for 61 minutes. We have confirmed eliminations of 940 ships, with an additional 312 showing drive failure or structural compromise. Their return fire has been significant but disorganized. They are targeting the drone swarms primarily, which is the correct tactical choice. But there are more drones than they can practically address. What has their total response been to our transmissions? I asked. None. No formal response. Their internal communications, which we have been monitoring continuously, show significant disagreement between fleet elements. Several squadron commanders have been arguing for an attempt to break through the fold denial boundary using physical thrust alone, essentially fly out at full speed and hope the barrier is not actually physical. He paused. It is not physical. They would just fly into empty space and still not be able to jump. Has anyone tried it? 3 ships attempted it approximately 20 minutes ago. They are now drifting outside the formation. No damage. We did not engage them. They simply cannot jump home. He looked at the display. I think that was a harder thing for their crews to process than taking fire, I thought. About that, there was something uniquely disorienting about discovering that the exit you thought there was simply gone fire you could respond to, an invisible wall that your best technology could not breach was a different kind of problem. It was a problem that lived in the mind, not in the tactical manual. Our assignment, HFY continued, is insertion to the Cath Command Cluster. UDEF Strategic has identified the flag formation, the 8 heaviest ships, sitting at the geometric center of the sphere as the likely location of Admiral First Voice. The objective is to reach the flag dreadnought, disable its command core to prevent self-destruct activation, and bring the Admiral into custody if possible. This is not a combat boarding in the traditional sense. We are not trying to capture the ship, we are trying to remove the ability of the Cath Command structure to end this engagement on their terms rather than ours. Owen was looking at the flag formation on the display. The dreadnought at its center was the largest ship in the entire Cath fleet. It was, by any measurement, enormous. 9 people, Owen said. 9 people plus Commander Voss and yourself, HFY said. 11, I was not questioning the odds, Owen said. I was just noting them. HFY almost smiled. Note them quickly. We insert in 8 minutes the journey from the edge of the engagement to the Cath Command Cluster was not the part of this I want to spend time on, because the details are technical and the tension was the kind that lives in your stomach rather than your head, a slow grinding awareness that every second brought you closer to a moment that could go in many different directions, most of them bad. What I will tell you is that HFY's flying during that transit was the finest piece of ship handling I have ever witnessed. He moved the ridgeline through the fire, coming from both directions, Cath weapons, UDEF drone engagement, debris from ships that were no longer ships, with a precision that made it look from the inside almost leisurely. We docked against the dreadnought's hull at 5:31 hours. The dreadnought was up close, even more enormous than the display suggested. Its hull was dark and layered, built in overlapping sections, like the scales of something ancient, and it had the feeling of a thing that had been made to last a very long time. It was probably 300 years old. It had survived things that should have destroyed it. It had been in engagements across multiple star systems. It had its long life, never once been boarded. That record ended at 5:32 hours. I have been in training exercises designed to simulate close quarters entry operations. I have studied the doctrines, run the scenarios, understood the principles. What I was not prepared for, despite all of that, was how quickly the Cath soldiers inside the dreadnought ran into a problem that none of their training had addressed. The corridors were wrong, not wrong by design, wrong for us specifically. They had been built for Cath bodies, which meant they were wide in some dimensions and narrow in others, with high ceilings and long open sight lines that their longer-limbed soldiers could use to their advantage. In open space, this would have been a problem for a human boarding party. In the Ridgeland's drill team, it was not, because HFY had spent 18 months running close quarters exercises, specifically in Cath proportioned corridor simulations that UDEF had built based on recovered schematics. The human team moved low and fast. The Cath soldiers were trained to expect opponents at their own height and their own speed. Neither of those Expectations was met. I watched Okafor's team move through the first 3 corridor junctions with a fluid efficiency that was almost difficult to follow, and I understood, in a way I had not fully understood before, what the word prepared actually meant. I stayed close to Owen and focused on the navigation overlay, guiding our path toward the command core. We were 12 minutes inside the ship. 1416. The command core was behind a sealed door that Cath engineering expected to be impenetrable. It was not impenetrable to the specific piece of equipment that Specialist Nina Webb, our technical officer, had been carrying since we boarded. It took her 40 seconds. Door opened inside. Admiral First Voice Vothkin, as his formal designation translated, was standing in the center of the command core with 4 of his senior officers. He was enormous. He was old. He had the bearing of someone who had spent centuries being the most dangerous entity in any room he occupied. He looked at us. He looked at the display behind him, which was still showing the state of the battle, which was not going well for his fleet. He looked back at us. One of his senior officers moved toward a console. Nina was faster. The self-destruct authorization interface went dark before the officer's hand reached it. Vothkin did not move. He watched everything with an expression that I could not read on a Cath face with any certainty, but which looked to me like a man doing rapid and very uncomfortable mathematics. Admiral, I said in Cath formal register. His eyes moved to me. We are asking you to stand down. Your fleet cannot jump out. Your reinforcements cannot jump in. Your command core self-destruct has been disabled. We are not here to harm you. We are here to end this engagement before more of your people die. There was a long silence. How long? He said, in his own language, slowly and carefully. Have you been preparing this? A long time, I said. He looked back at his display. The numbers were not improving. In the time we had been standing in his command core, his fleet had lost another 90 ships. You are one world, he said. One species. Yes, I said. This is not possible. And yet, I said. He stood still for another long moment, then very slowly, with the deliberate movements of someone performing an action they had never expected to perform, he reached to the command interface and broadcast fleet-wide signal in the Cath command and frequency. The signal translated meant halt all weapons. It took the fleet about 3 minutes to comply. Not all of them did immediately. Some of the outer formation elements apparently needed the signal repeated or chose not to believe it the first time, but it spread ship by ship until the tactical display that Owen was watching from his position near the door showed weapons fire falling off across the entire formation. Owen let out a breath. It is quiet, he said. It is quiet, I agreed. Volk Khan was still watching his display. The expression on his face was not one I could fully name, but I thought, looking at him, that I was seeing something that had not happened in the history of the Cath Empire, something that their doctrine, their history, their entire understanding of how the galaxy worked had not prepared them for. Not defeat exactly, something harder than defeat. The discovery that the story they had been telling themselves about the nature of the universe was wrong. I did not feel anything triumphant about that. I felt something quieter and sadder and more complicated, because I knew what came next was not going to be simple. Battle was over. What came after it was going to take much longer. The room where I sat across from Voth K-Han for the first time under formal conditions was small and deliberately plain. Table, 2 chairs, a single overhead light, and a viewport showing nothing but open space. UDEF Command had spent considerable time debating what environment to use for this meeting and had ultimately landed on the plainest option available. No flags, no insignia, no visible display of capability, just 2 people in a room with a table between them. I was not sure Voth K-Han appreciated the intent. He spent the first minute after sitting down looking at the viewport, at the ceiling, at the walls, as though he was conducting his own quiet assessment of where he was and what it meant. He had been given accommodation aboard the carrier that was appropriate to his rank, which I understood had been a philosophical debate of its own within UDEF logistics, and he had spent the first 2 days saying nothing to anyone. He did not look like a man who had been defeated. He looked like a man who was still processing a sequence of events his mind had not yet fully accepted as real. I had been given no specific instructions about how to conduct this conversation. Colonel Marsh had said simply that I was the right person to do it because I had been the first to see the fleet arrive, the first to hear the surrender demand, and the one who had stood in Voth K-Han's command corps and asked him to stop. There was a continuity there that Marsh apparently felt mattered. I was not certain he was right, but I did not argue. I have been trying to identify where we made the error, Voth K-Han said. He spoke in Kayath first, and the translation came through a device on the table. His voice, in any language, had the same quality. Measured, unhurried. In 600 years we have never needed to conduct a post-engagement analysis of this kind. The analysis has always been simple. We deployed superior force. The opposing population made a rational strategic decision, and the outcome was in line with projection. Your error, I said carefully, was your survey data. Survey data was 40 years old, he said. That was confirmed, but the error is not merely the age of the data. I have been reviewing what the data said and comparing it to what we found 40 years ago. Your species had not yet achieved fold space technology. You had not yet established permanent habitation beyond your home world. You were, by any standard classification, a pre-contact civilization in the early expansion phase. He paused. In 600 years, no pre-contact civilization has ever been encountered that had already prepared a defensive response at this scale. No pre-contact civilization had ever had 60 years of warning, I said. He looked at me directly for the first time since we had sat down. His eyes were large and amber-colored and very old. You knew we were coming. We found one of your survey probes, I said, 22 years ago, and we found an older transmission, your catalog notation for our system, about 40 years ago. We knew what it meant. We knew what came after it because we had been watching what happened to other species when they received the same notation. You watched, he said. We watched, I agreed. We watched 12 different species receive the same visit you gave us. We watched what happened when they negotiated. We watched what happened when they resisted without preparation. We watched what happened when they tried to run. I kept my voice even. We decided we did not want any of those outcomes. Voth-Kun was quiet for a moment. Your species chose to fight. We chose to be ready, I said. Fighting was what happened when you did not stand down. He turned back to the viewport. Species we have encountered before, the ones who chose to fight, fought because they had no other option. They fought out of desperation. Some of them fought well given what they had. But they were always operating from a position of shock. They had not known we were coming. They had not had time to prepare. They were reacting. Yes, I said. You were not reacting. No, another silence. Longer. I let stretch, because I had been told by people who understood these things that silence in a conversation with a Kav was not something to fill quickly. They used silence differently than humans did. For them, silence was often where the real thinking happened. 462 species, he said finally. That is the number that have been formally catalogued and assessed by the Empire during my service. Of those, 211 were brought into the labor classification. 97 were reclassified to non-viable status and processed accordingly. The remainder were ongoing assessments or systems with insufficient population to merit the resource expenditure. He said all of this with the same even tone he might use to describe a record-keeping system. I have overseen 23 assessment operations. Personally, I know, I said. 23, he repeated, and in 23 operations I have never stood in a room like this, across a table from the representative of a species that had prepared specifically for my arrival. He paused. I want to understand how that is possible, not tactically. I have reviewed the tactical elements and I understand how you achieved what you achieved. I want to understand how a civilization makes that choice, how you sustain 80 years of preparation for a threat that has not yet arrived, how you keep the knowledge of that preparation secret, how you build over generations a response to something that most of your people probably hoped would never come. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the engineers I had never met, the ones who had hollowed asteroids and seeded orbital caches and written targeting algorithms and quietly, stubbornly refused to believe that hoping for the best was the same as preparing for it. I thought about the original group, the small, unfashionable, frequently dismissed group who had looked at a piece of alien data and decided that the correct response was not panic, not denial, not diplomacy, but work. We are afraid of a lot of things, I said. Individually and as a species, we are very good at being afraid, but we have this, I do not know if there is a cath word for it, a tendency when we are afraid of something and we cannot make the fear go away. We start building, we start planning, we start asking what would happen if the worst case came true, and then we start working on the answer. I paused. Most of the time the worst case never arrives and all the preparation is wasted, but the preparation is not the point. The preparation is how we manage the fear. It is how we get up in the morning and keep doing the work. Voth-Kun was listening with a stillness that I had come to understand was his version of close attention. The people who built what stopped your fleet, most of them are dead, I said. They did not live to see it used. A lot of them probably thought it would never be used. They built it anyway because they were human. And humans do not know how to leave a threat unaddressed. That is not rational, he said. No, I said, it is Not, he looked at me for a long moment. What does your government intend to do? Now we intend to talk to the species. Your empire has absorbed, I said, all of them. We want to know which of them want to be free. We want to know what resources they need and what support we can offer. We are not interested in building an empire of our own. We are interested in building a different kind of structure, one based on mutual defense rather than dominance. The empire will not permit that. The empire, I said gently, is currently missing 17,000 warships and has 3 outer sectors that have already suspended tribute payments to the Imperial Corps. I do not think the Empire is in a position to permit or not permit very much right. Now he was silent. On the viewport too, UDEF carriers were holding position against a backdrop of stars there, running lights steady in the dark. You said the question you want to ask the absorbed species, he said. What is the question? I had said this to him in the command corps when the battle was still live and everything was moving too fast for reflection. He had heard it then and apparently not forgotten it. I appreciated that. Same question someone should have asked us, I said, 80 years ago when your probe was drifting through our system and we were quietly starting to panic. Someone should have come to us and asked us a simple thing. I looked at him steadily. Do you want help? He looked back at me. His expression was, as always, difficult to read, but something in it had shifted. No one has ever asked us that, he said. Not about the other species. About the Cath. His voice was very quiet. I had not expected that. I held it for a moment because it mattered and I did not want to answer it carelessly. I know, I said. He did not say anything else for a long time. Neither did I. We sat in the plane room with the viewport between us in the quiet of a finished battle around us, and I thought about what it meant to be the first species in the history of the Cath Empire to have asked that question out loud where they could hear it. The Mutual Defense Compact was signed in open space, not aboard any ship, not on any planet, but in a pressurized module suspended at the midpoint between Earth and the Moon, because UDEF Command had decided that no single nation and no single world should be able to claim the location as a symbol of their own prominence. The signing was attended by representatives of 11 species. By the time it was finalized, 7 more had sent observer delegations. I was there, not as a primary delegate. That role belonged to people with far more diplomatic training than I had, but as a witness because Colonel Marsh had decided that the chain of continuity mattered and that the person who had been watching when the fleet arrived should also be present when the first formal consequence of that arrival was concluded. I stood near the viewport of the signing module and watched the gathered representatives and thought about the 6 months that had passed since 3:12 hours on that Tuesday morning when a coffee mug had hit a floor in my life had divided itself permanently into before and after. The 6 months had been full. That is the most efficient way I can put it. The tactical aftermath of the engagement had taken weeks to fully resolve. The Cath ships that were still functional had needed to be accounted for. Their crews had needed to be processed. The logistics of feeding and housing 60 million Cath military personnel who were now technically prisoners of a species they had come to eliminate had been an exercise in improvisation at a scale that nobody had fully anticipated. We had managed it. Not perfectly but adequately, which is all any large undertaking can realistically hope for. The political aftermath had been more complex and more interesting. 3 Cath outer sectors, Varith, Monos 4 and the cluster, formerly designated the Amber Reach, had suspended their tribute and service obligations to the Imperial Corps within the first 2 weeks after the battle. They had done this not primarily because of any inspiration from humanity, but because the Cath imperial system was built on the assumption of imperial military invincibility, and that assumption had been clearly and publicly disproven. Species and systems that had been paying tribute not out of affection but out of terror had looked at the result and made a rational calculation. The empire was not going to collapse overnight. It was old and deep-rooted, and still enormously powerful in many regions, but the story had changed. The story had changed in a way that was going to keep changing, and the people who told stories for a living, propagandists, historians, cultural architects in a dozen different species, were already working with new material. Voth Khan remained in Udif custody. He had, as I had mentioned to him in our conversation, performed the formal Cath ritual of acknowledged defeat, ceremony that had not been conducted in imperial records for over 400 years, because it required the acknowledging party to believe that the defeat was genuine and not temporary. He had conducted it publicly and transmitted it to the Imperial Corps. The political implications of that single act were still being assessed by people far more qualified than me to assess them. We had spoken several more times after that first formal meeting, not always about grand topics, once for nearly 2 hours about music, whether the Cath had anything equivalent, what it meant to them, how it functioned in their culture. I learned things in those conversations that I could not have learned from any intelligence document. I came to understand that Vathkin was not a monster and not a symbol. He was an old being who had operated within a system for so long that he had come to mistake the system for reality, and who was now at the end of a very long life encountering the genuine article for the first time. I cannot tell you I liked him. I can tell you I respected the quality of his attention and the honesty with which he engaged with questions that must have been profoundly uncomfortable. He never pretended the things his empire had done were anything other than what they were. He never offered justifications that he did not himself fully believe. When I told him what had happened to the species catalogued as non-viable and processed accordingly, and asked him directly whether he had known the full detail of those operations, he looked at me for a long time and said, yes, he had known. He said it with the flat precision of someone who had decided that the only thing left available to them was accuracy. I thought about that a great deal. The compact signing, when it happened, was quiet. The representatives moved through it in order, each one adding their authorization in the form their own culture required, and the translated text appeared in 17 languages simultaneously on screens that ringed. The module, the core of it was simple. Any signatory species that came under military threat would have access to human defensive technology, training, and where necessary, active support. In exchange, signatories committed to the same for each other. The humans were not the leaders of the compact. We were deliberately one voice among several. This had been a point of considerable internal UDEF debate. with some arguing that humanity had earned a position of central authority and others arguing correctly. I thought that building another dominance hierarchy was precisely what we had spent 80 years trying to prevent, the latter argument. One, I was glad, after the signing, I found myself standing near the viewport again, and I became aware that I was not alone. A young Cath officer, barely into the age of service based on the markings on his rank indicators, had moved to stand nearby. He was tall as all Cath were, but without the settled mass of age. He watched the gathering with the wide, careful attention of someone who was still learning how to read the world. He had been part of the survivor processings, one of 60 million. He had spent 2 months in the interim accommodation facilities before the formalities of the compact had made his status complicated enough to be transferred to the observation delegation. I had seen his file, his name translated to the nearest human phonetic equivalent was something like Saran. He was, by the best estimate of the cultural assessors, approximately the Cath equivalent of 22 years old. He spoke without looking at me. The compact contains a training provision, he said. His translated voice was careful, like someone who had been practicing a conversation. It does, I said. The provision allows for military training exchange, defensive doctrine, technology orientation. He paused. Species other than humans can apply to send personnel for the first training cohort. That is correct. He was quiet for a moment. My sector. I am from Vareth. We are one of the 3 sectors that suspended imperial obligation. He said this like he was explaining something he was still working out himself. We have our own concerns. Other concerns. There are things in the outer reaches of Vareth space that the Empire never had any interest in addressing because they were not strategically significant to the core. But they are significant to us. I looked at him. He was still watching the gathered representatives, his amber eyes steady and serious. You want to apply for the training cohort? I said. I want to know if it would be considered. He said. Vareth is not fully independent. We are still formally part of the imperial structure, but we are also 3 months into deciding what it means to have a choice that we did not previously know we had. He paused again. I am told that humans have experience with that specific problem. I thought about 80 years of quiet work. I thought about the engineers who had hollowed out asteroids while telling their families they were on a standard rotation. I thought about Dr. Harriet Cole, who had died convinced her life's work would never matter, and whose life's work had just rewritten the galaxy. I thought about Owen Frey saying honestly no, but let us go anyway, and meaning it with complete sincerity. I thought about Voth Khan asking me how a civilization sustains 80 years of preparation, and what I had told him. We start building. We start planning. We ask what would happen if the worst case came true, and then we start working on the answer. Yes, I said to the young Cath officer. It would be considered. He looked at me directly then. His expression was the same difficult to read Cath arrangement of features that I had spent 6 months learning to parse, and what I read in it, with whatever confidence I could claim, was the particular combination of fear and determination that looks the same on every face of every species that has ever decided to stop waiting for someone else to solve their problem. Thank you, he said. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same as they had always been. Indifferent, ancient, scattered across a darkness that had no opinion about anything that happened within it. But the ships holding position in that darkness were different from the ships that had been there 6 months ago. There were more of them, and they flew. Signals I did not recognize yet, and they would keep coming, I thought, as long as we kept asking the right question. I looked out at them for a long time. 11 species already signed. 7 more sending observers. 60 million Cath personnel scattered across our system, slowly, carefully beginning to understand that the outcome of the last 6 months was not a humiliation, but an opening. One old admiral sitting in a plain room somewhere on the carrier, probably staring at a viewport and thinking about a question no one had ever asked his people. I thought about a Tuesday morning and a coffee mug hitting the floor and an alarm screaming violet across every screen in a small station. At the edge of everything, the Empire had launched their fleet to decide our fate. They had arrived expecting a survey to be accurate. They had found 80 years of patient, stubborn, very human work waiting for them. They had sent 17,000 ships to silence one world. That world had sent one diplomat back, and the Empire had been listening ever since.